97.3 ESPN presents The Sports Bash with Mike Gill. We're talking Eagles football and all the latest NFL news and notes with 97.3 ESPN Eagles and NFL Insider John McMullen on the play-by-play home of the Philadelphia Eagles and NFL football. 97.3 ESPN, brought to you by Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. 373 South Whitehorse Pike, Hamilton. Visit GinoPinto.com. Now, the Sports Bash with Mike Gill and Pete Thompson and 97.3 ESPN Eagles and NFL Insider John McMullen on 97.3 ESPN and streaming everywhere at 97.3ESPN.com and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app.
All right, John, there we go.
That was a long open.
The debut of the new McMullen intro.
Wow, that's spectacular. And, you know, quick note of trivia, I'm wearing a Ric Flair style robe as we do this.
Hey, I love it.
Does it have feathers?
Of course, you got to have feathers.
Is it a feathered robe that you're going with today? By the way, as you heard, John McMullen's appearance brought to you by Gino Pinto, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. NFL news and notes, and, of course, the Eagles today with the head coach, Doug Peterson, at the podium, and a lot of interesting things. Like we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but Doug kind of compounded it today. They understand that this is probably, and you wrote about this, this is the biggest test they have to date facing Russell Wilson.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it when you think about the environment as well and the fact that it's on the road in Seattle. We all know how difficult that is a place to play. And so you put that into the equation as well. But while you say that, you know, the Seahawks have taken some serious hits, especially on the defensive side of the football, which is generally the strength of that team, and the fact that Richard Sherman is out for the year, Cam Chancellor's out for the year. So, you know, the Legion of Boom is sort of the Legion of Gloom now, and basically it's Earl Thomas and a bunch of guys. So it's not quite the same Seattle Seahawks, but the part that is the same is Russell Wilson and how difficult he is to deal with because he's such a unique player.
Yeah, and this is a team that the secondary is really banged up. But, John, the Eagles have run the ball for 175 yards or more in the last 3 games. Can they continue that formula against this Seattle team?
Yeah, I don't know, because their front is still pretty impressive, even though the defensive line hasn't been quite as good as we all thought it was going to be on paper. Cliff Abel's another guy who's gone. But those linebackers, Bobby Wagner specifically, if we talk about, in Philadelphia we talk about Carson Wentz, and he's right there with Tom Brady as an MVP candidate. Well, Bobby Wagner is right there as one of the top 2 or 3 potential candidates for Defensive Player of the Year. He's that good, and KJ Wright is one of the better linebackers, especially from a coverage aspect in football. So they're still really strong up front. So we'll see. I mean, the Eagles have been very impressive running the football, as you mentioned. The offensive line has been great, especially the right side. But this is going to be more difficult than usual, no question about that.
John, what would it mean for the Eagles to beat this team on Sunday night? I mean, I know that they've been impressive all year, but this is a championship football team that has guys that's been there. Russell Wilson, Pete Carroll, Bobby Wagner. I mean, granted, they're missing Chancellor and Sherman, but this is still a team that's 7-4 and still has their eyes on the division title.
Yeah, and they still have that cachet. Everybody thinks about the Seahawks, and still, as you mentioned, even though it might only be the skeleton of what it once was, the Russell Wilsons and the Pete Carrolls and the Darrell Bevels and the Doug Baldwins and the Wagners and the Wrights, they're all still there. And Earl Thomas might be the best of them all, but so it's still, anytime you go to Seattle and you're able to win, you feel pretty good about yourself as a football team. So, and then you have the second part of it in the event today about the Eagles closing in on the NFC East. That's no longer one of their goals, because whether it happens on Thursday or Sunday or next week, they're going to win the NFC East. So now It's about getting the first-round bye, and it's about getting that number 1 seed. So they got to keep winning.
When you look at the matchups, this defensive line versus the Seahawks offensive line, or vice versa, what is the biggest key for the Eagles to continue their success, especially on the road in Seattle, where it can get pretty loud?
Well, I think it is containing Russell Wilson, and as Jim Schwartz talked about earlier in this week, that's more difficult than maybe any other quarterback in the NFL. There's other guys who are mobile, and Carson's one of them. And the Eagles faced Cam Newton, who obviously is tremendously mobile earlier in the season. But Russell does it a different way. And Jim kind of talked about his ability to go backward in the pocket. Like, nobody does that. And he had to go all the way back to Fran Tarkenton. I wrote about it today. Generally, when you have a quarterback that does that, you want to sit him. But he's successful doing it, and he's able to extend the play. And there's nobody in football, I don't care how good you are, if a quarterback extends the play as long as Russell Wilson does, eventually he's going to hurt you, and that's what you have to do. You have to find a way to contain him in the pocket. And normally you want your ends, obviously, to hold the edge, and you want to be very, very disciplined on the pass rush and get an interior push so he can't climb the pocket. Well, you have to add an extra part of that. With Russell, because he does go backwards and he does escape the pocket that way. So that's what makes him Russell Wilson.
Yeah, and I'm a big Russell Wilson guy. He's one of my favorite players. In fact, I have him as in the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL. I know a lot of people don't put him on that pedestal, but he keeps you in every single game. But this is a Seahawks team, John, that doesn't run the ball very well, right? So the Eagles can kind of pin their ears back a little bit in this one. That should be interesting because they stop the run really well, but this team don't run the ball a lick.
No, and we just saw a team that runs the ball really well, and they couldn't run the ball a lick against the Eagles front. I mean, the Eagles are the number 1 ranked run defense in football. Nobody basically has been able to run the football. Dallas got a few little runs here and there. But when you talk about holding Jordan Howard and Tariq Cohen to negative 6 yards, that's as good as it gets. It starts with the front. Wrote about that today, and you think about how deep the Eagles are on their front. You got superstars. You got Fletcher Cox. You got Brandon Graham. You got the guy I described as the linchpin to it all, and Tim Jernigan, kind of the final piece to the puzzle about fitting in so perfectly. And then you have Derek Barnett, who looks like he's going to be a star down the road. You got Chris Long. You got Vinny Curry. And even people nobody talks about, like Bo Allen and Destiny Vallejo. It's good. It's deep. And they're going to beat up that Seattle offensive line, which is not very good. But that's where Russell comes into the equation. It's never been very good. They've won Super Bowls. They almost won 2. They won 1 and were a yard away from another with a bad offensive
Speaking of that,
line.
did you see Marshawn Lynch's tweet yesterday?
I did not. What did
he said benching Eli almost as stupid as not running the ball on the 1-yard line in the Super Bowl.
Well, hey, obviously Marshawn.
Something I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but it was somewhere down that road.
Yeah, well, obviously, and that's kind of revisionist history. I was at that Super Bowl. People don't realize Seattle had 2 earlier, 3rd and 4th and shorts, and did not make them. There's that part of it. There's the part of it that it was a poor route run. So there's a lot of things.
By the way, actually, it was not a blue arrowed, a blue check marked Marshawn Lynch. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But no, hey, Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman is still upset about that.
Yeah.
He has not been able to let it go because that would have been back-to-back Super Bowl titles, and you're talking about, that's very obviously very, very difficult to do. So there were a lot of guys upset with it, but, come on. Are you going to complain about Russell Wilson
I remember that Monday. I was on here saying I didn't have a problem with it, and people were just livid.
Yeah,
for some of the reasons. Some of the reasons you just get. I mean, if I know you're going to run the ball, you know what I mean? I mean, they weren't getting the short yardage.
Yeah, and they were having a bad day running the football in short yardage. He had brought him back to that point. You would assume now he deserves some criticism. You probably shouldn't throw that ball when you see it's a bad route and live to play another down or just try to throw it out of the back of the end zone. But, hey, I don't know a quarterback in the history of football that hasn't made mistakes. He just happened to make a mistake on the biggest stage at the worst time. But I always say, people who say that, remember, he made a mistake on the biggest stage at the worst time because he was on the biggest stage. You got to get there to make that mistake, and it's really difficult to get there.
John, Scott Grayson here. Interesting. I know you were talking about Russell Wilson and how he can make plays last longer. How do you think Jim Schwartz is going to try to defend him? I mean, the Eagles really haven't played a quarterback like Wilson this season. I know you could say, Carolina with Cam Newton is somewhat like that. But how do you think that Jim Schwartz is going to approach handling Russell Wilson and trying to keep him in check?
Well, I think he's drumming into his defensive lineman this week, that even more so than other weeks. And you always preach what I just talked about, and that's discipline on the pass rush. And you want it every week, but it's especially significant this week. Because if you have a defensive end crashing when he's not supposed to, all of a sudden you leave containment on the edge, and it's gone. Russell's going to get outside the pocket, and he's going to kill you, whether it's running the football, whether it's throwing it downfield. So it's got to be really, really disciplined this week. Alignment and assignment is what the coaches always talk about, and it's about keeping them contained in the pocket and getting the push. And then, as I mentioned, if he does go backwards, the cornerbacks and the safeties and everybody in coverage has to realize this isn't a typical week as well. And you can't give up on coverage because if you do, you're going to look up and he's going to be extending the play, and you're going to lose somebody down the football field.
When you look at this West Coast swing here, John, obviously it's a big deal for the Eagles. They could potentially come back to Philly with a great situation, or they could come back with a whole lot of work to do. It's been interesting kind of hearing the guys talk a little bit going into this, that they're really looking forward to this. They haven't had a close game, in a while. I know you could say 9-7 at Dallas was close, but they haven't been in a meaningful fourth quarter in a long time. How important do you think it would be for this team to play in a meaningful fourth quarter at one or both of these two games coming up in the next couple weeks?
Yeah, I know. People have kind of asked Doug that question, and I guess you do want to see how your team, in a weird way, kind of handles a tight fourth quarter. But on the other hand, if you're winning by 28, 28, 28, and 23, whatever it was over the past month, that's pretty good. I don't think you throw that away. I think the ultimate goal is to dominate, and the Eagles have been able to do that. And I think that's why they have a ton of confidence going into what looks like a really difficult trip. Typically, you go into this trip and just want to survive and say, can we get a win? Can we just not lose two? Not this team. This team thinks they're winning every game, and I don't blame them. And that said, I think we'll know a lot more about the NFC over the 2 weeks, not only because of the Eagles, who face the Seahawks and the Rams on the road, but the Vikings are going on the road to face the Falcons and the Panthers back-to-back. So that's basically all the good teams in the NFC are playing each other over the next 2 weeks. And the best two teams are on the road against really good teams for the next 2 weeks. So I think we're going to know a lot more when the dust settles.
Last question for you, John, here. I've heard some speculation about Jay Ajayi. He's gotten caught from behind a couple of times. I know his teammates are giving him a hard time about it, but I also know that Ajayi's frustrated by getting caught from behind. Is he lacking that extra gear that he might have had when he was a little younger? Or is he potentially banged up a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, he's a big back. And, defensive backs in this league are really, really fast. So the only guy who I've ever seen at 225 run away from people is Adrian Peterson in his prime. I mean, people can make fun of him and say he's getting caught from behind, but look, he's had a run of over 30 yards or more in every game he's been as an Eagle. He's only been here 3 games, and he's broken a big one in every game. Now, he fumbled in the last one, but nobody's done that. Name the back. LaShawn McCoy, Ricky Waters, Brian Westbrook, Deuce Staley. Nobody's done that. Jay Ajayi's done that. So, from that standpoint, it's a big addition to the offense that the Eagles didn't have before they acquired him. Now, whether he gets caught from behind by a D-back that can run a 4.4, I don't think that's as big as a deal as him breaking off the 30-yard run. What he's got to do, and he can't do, is not fumble the football. And that's why he was so frustrated against the Bears, and I think he understands that.
Plenty of info right now on our website, 973ESPN.com, from John on the Eagles and the Seahawks and the NFL. And, of course, we'll have more tomorrow on the show as we get you ready for Thursday Night Football, too. It's a big game for Eagles fans because they can clinch the division tomorrow night with a Dallas loss to the Redskins. So we'll have plenty more on that. And, John, we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, too. All 6 teams that get into the NFC playoff field right now have a story to tell as to why they could be a favorite to win the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it's an extremely deep conference as opposed to the AFC, which looks like a 2-team race. As I said, what I mentioned when you talk about the Eagles, the Vikings, the Rams, the Seahawks, the Panthers, the Falcons, every single one of them is a good football team, and they're feeling pretty good about themselves.
All right, we'll talk again tomorrow, pal.
All right, thanks, yes.